Hi, everybody. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, who has gone to the incredible effort and not to mention expense of remapping the keys so that when I type, I don't actually hit spacebar and lose the audio. It's the cops. Cheese it. Nobody says cheese it anymore. I don't remember when people said cheese it, but I just think that's kind of cool. So anyway, things are going well here. I have something I'm just so excited about previewing. It's tempting to just jump right into it. Maybe I will. Good to see you guys too. Good to see everybody. Your humble narrator has been really busy. I know it usually is the excuse I'm trotting out, but this time I got some evidence. Trevor from Florida. The call's coming from inside the house. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's just great. Anyway, I got permission from my insect overlords to be able to leak one photo of something I've been working on for the last, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks now, I guess. I'm not terribly in love with the picture in terms of being flattering to me. However, it's just wicked cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to be taking questions from BillWhittle.com. We got a live stream over on BillWhittle.com. It's going to be a fun night. And I'm going to be going over there to check the comments too. But right now I'm just watching the the comments live on Twitch. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting evening. Okay. Apparently, somebody is bashing down a concrete wall on the other side of my drywall here. Anyway, I've been working on something for quite a while. I've got another week's worth of work to do, and then it'll be held for a little while in the hands of very capable people, and then it will be released into the wild. So I'm going to show you that one picture that's been cleared for release. I'm not really going to say much about it, but if since I'm watching the comments right at the moment in Twitch as we do this live, I'm curious to know how long it will take people to guess what it is, and I suspect the limit will be about the limit of the ping. In other words, about 2 or 3 seconds out and back. Ready? Okay, hang on a second. Where'd it go? Here it goes. Tell me what you think. What is that all about? Hey, ho, ho. It's great. Yeah, that's right. Exnor's. Oh my God, Exnor's first. Yep. All of them coming in, and a bunch of people. It is freaking cool. It is special on Apollo 11. It's going to be 4 hours special, or 4 segments special anyway. Pretty near 4 hours. And that's really about all I can say about the actual show, other than to say I walked into this set and it just blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. There's nothing like a practical set, and this is just the coolest set I've ever been on. Certainly, I am not Walter Cronkite, fortunately. But yes, you guys got it right. It's about Apollo 11. And John Pershing for the win. Like I said, I told him I wouldn't tell anything about this, but I can't. I'm not going to really deny somebody when somebody gets it right, because there's something else I did kind of want to talk to you about. It's John Pershing said doing Apollo 11 in real time. I don't know if it'd be fun to do it in real time. Maybe, it's a really good idea. This is going to be released well before the 20th of July, the 50th anniversary. Needless to say, as they do this kind of platform rollout where they reveal more and more, we'll be putting that all up on Facebook and all that material on the website. So I don't want to. I don't want to. I don't want to be like too teasy, but I just really asked if I could get something to show because it has affected our schedule for this week and maybe last week as well. But yeah, it's tremendously cool. I wrote 4 one-hour segments. And yeah, somebody's pointing out some of these other things. Series from PDI to Touchdown. Martin Archer pointed that out. I used a lot of references, but the nice thing about this is, given the amount of time that we've got, 4 hours. I don't know that you could do 4. I don't know if I could do 4 hours on Apollo 11, but I can do 4 hours on the space program, and that's basically what we're doing. I just have to be a little bit careful here. How do I just want to think. I know what I want to say. I just got to be careful. The set is so good. You're very kind. John Pershing says I could do 4 hours on the LEM landing struts. Yeah, probably could actually. So obviously we're gonna deal with Apollo 11, but we get to keep cutting back from what's happening on Apollo 11, and we basically look at the whole space program. And the first thing we do after the Apollo 11 landing hook is that's a good idea, Kulak. That is a fantastic idea. I'm glad I thought of it. Hang on a second. Wow. Not often I actually stop to write things down, but that's bloody brilliant. Never occurred to me. Okay, so basically, we get to talk about the space program, and I get to say things like, you can't understand the moon landing if you don't understand how cap guns work. And so we get into the whole pop culture and all of that stuff. The reason I brought up cap guns was I really have to set the scene, I really got 4 hours to take people back into the space age. And cap guns, the reason you can't understand the moon landing if you don't know what cap guns were like is because cap guns represented an elegant and interesting solution to the problem, the practical problem. And the practical problem with a cap gun is I want to play cowboys and Indians, and I've got my trusty, chrome Colt revolver, and when I pointed it at a guy, I wanted to go bang. That's an engineering problem, and it's not a question of me taking it into Unreal and adding particle effects and doing a nice 3D rendering of the thing and texturing the handle and all that other stuff. It's got to work out in the real world, and that means it's got to be solved. And that may not seem like a close comparison, but I think it's I'm very happy with it. I think it perfectly captures the age. I think the age of the space age. I think it captures all of it. I mentioned a little bit about Johnny Astro, which I've talked about before on this show. But when I'm talking about the pop culture, I get to say something along the lines of, Johnny Astro is this toy from the 60s that I just loved, maybe my favorite toy ever. and basically you have a handle, and it connects to a fan. The fan looks like a radar dish. There's a little landing pad, and you put a regular balloon on it, just a regular old party balloon, except this says United States on the side. And it's not filled with helium, it's just a balloon. It's got a little landing gear thing that you tape on the bottom, and it just sits there. And then if you increase the power on the fan by running the really cool throttle up, then and you do this correctly. If you put in too much juice, you just blow the balloon off the pad. You don't put in enough, nothing happens. And you got to aim at the right place too, because you have to aim it over the top of the balloon. But if you do that correctly, you will take advantage of an aerodynamic phenomenon called the Coanda effect. And I knew the name of the Coanda effect, and it's going to be in color, but somebody asked it's going to be in black and white. It's going to be in color. My eyes are not. Oh yes, AOC. Anyway, you get it. I should have a cigar. I should tempted to be smoking a cigarette just because it looks so wicked. But here's a point I tried to make here, because I really do think this is germane, and I also want to talk about this a little bit to warm up before we get the show rolling here. Okay, so, and I mentioned this in the show, which I'm very, very, very excited about. Hang on, I have to open a separate window and all the rest of this garbage. It's just terrible. Must be nice. Hang on a second. Yeah, because one thing that was nice about the work I was doing was I had actual team of highly trained professionals around me who cared about the outcome and left me frightened and confused. Try this one more time. I don't know if this is the exact. No, it's not either. I just want to kind of get it right. I forgot. I'm trying to find where the. This might be it. Anyway, sorry about the delay. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm tired of looking for it. The nice thing about it is I get to read the definition of the Coanda effect, and basically, it's a paragraph of reasonably advanced aerodynamics and physics. The Coanda effect is the result of a stream wanting to remain attached to the surface of a convex blah 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 blah. It's just a paragraph of the Coanda effect, and my conclusion from this was that in the space age, the guys who weren't smart enough to work on the Apollo program were making toys that used advanced aerodynamic techniques and very, very finely machined and linked mechanical devices in order to fly balloons around a room, and that's the kind of time it was. I never really liked. This is really kind of what I wanted to talk about, because sometimes this show's just therapy more than anything else. The set is absolutely magnificent. It's incredible. Parts of it are older than they should be, but I sat down in that chair, and I'll just show it to you one more time. Sat down in that chair, and I said to myself, "Look, it's Captain Analog," and all of that's true. So here's the thing I've been kind of wrestling with. It is a little disturbing that all of this is kind of nostalgia, and yet that's kind of what it is. And I have been happy about, and also a little conflicted about. I can't tell you about that right now, Exnora, where it's coming from, but believe me, you will hear about it. yeah, there's a lot of in there that's a little older than it needs to be, but um, it just looks so great. Uh, what am I trying to say? Okay, so here's what I'm trying to say. As I wrote this stuff, it's 4 hours. It's a small book, actually. It's like 33,000 words, something like that. Um, I began to realize that the space age is not really, it's not really a generational cohort. I mean, technically speaking, um, the space age was pretty much pulled off by the silent generation. The reason you never heard of them is because there's a silent generation. But after the greatest generation and before the baby boom, the guys that grew up in the 50s and then into the 60s were the guys that actually did the moon landing. I was 10 when they landed on the moon. I was the tail end of the baby boom, so I was too late for that. But I wasn't too late for the space age. I grew up in the space age. And everything I do and everything I say, and in fact, all the things that I uh, just interested in, I firewall, eject, afterburner, Stratosphere Lounge, all of this stuff is all connected to the space age. And I always thought it was connected to aviation, but I never really fully realized, no, it's the space age. And the space age is a golden time, was a golden time. And it's possible, if this does well, that we might be able to do some more work in there. And I just kind of realized, you know, it would be great if somebody could be kind of a spokesman for the space age, because it was a really remarkable time. And and I've been feeling really pretty sad about it lately. Obviously, things kind of going downhill from where I stood. If you were watching every single 2 months, there was a Saturn V lifting off every 2 or 3 months, going further and further and further. So it's getting a little depressing out there for me. But the thing that I was most struck about, really, really struck about, was I was looking back on it, and I had this thought. It was like, oh, it was a great time to grow up. It was a pretty dream and an illusion, but just not realistic. And then I almost like psychologically, I just slapped myself in the face. It's like it wasn't a dream. We didn't paint pictures about going to the moon, and we didn't do plays about going to the moon. We went to the frickin' moon, and and what um, and what that made me realize is that world is not a fantasy world. It's not a world. It's not a science fiction world. It's what people can do when they're at their best. Um, and and it has been so bloody disappointing this last half century. But then I realized, who's actually speaking for that time. A lot of what I do is based on the fact that I grew up doing that time. But who's actually really just speaking, for the space age? Because what happened in the space age is almost, well, that's why so many people today have a hard time believing it. Um, it's incredible. It's almost inconceivable. And the main goal I had actually writing this thing was constantly writing with moon landing deniers in mind. Now you've all seen me here with this, but there are the moon landing deniers just make smoke curl out of my ears. Fire comes out of my eyes with the 9/11 conspiracy folks, but the moon landing thing is a close second. And needless to say, as you've seen, I've been just really, really, absolutely, genuinely enraged by it. But when I was doing the research for this and figuring out how to structure it, I realized something that gave me a lot more patience with people, mostly young people who don't believe the moon landing ever happened. Uh, and what that was I realized that young people who were born way after the moon landing, to them, this idea of landing on the moon from a modern perspective, we landed on the moon 50 years ago. Oh, it can't be possible. They say it can't be possible, I think, emotionally, because they look at the moon landing as something that just kind of parachuted into our lives in the 60s. Like, we were basically sitting there and going to Vietnam and doing our thing and, and listening to rock and roll music, and all of a sudden say, hey, we're landed on the moon. Oh, really? Wow. But the thing about the moon landing that I've been working so hard to get across, and I think I've done a good job with it. The thing about the moon landing is that Apollo 11 is a miracle compared to, well, today, for example, it's just a miracle. But Apollo 11 was not a miracle compared to Apollo 10. Apollo 10 went to the moon, orbited the moon. They took the LEM, detached it, took it down to 50,000 feet. That's about a third again higher than your commercial airline flight. And they both got a chance to go back. John Young and Gene Cernan in Apollo 10 came down to 50,000 feet from the moon. And then they basically did the abort option and ditched the bottom. I think they ditched the bottom stage. I'm not 100% sure about that. But I know certainly they didn't land, and they came back up and rendezvoused, went home. So compared to Apollo 10, Apollo 11 was still impressive, but it wasn't magic compared to Apollo 10. Apollo 10 wasn't magic compared to Apollo 9. 9 wasn't magic compared to 8. 8 wasn't magic compared to 7. And then all of the Gemini missions going backwards, all the way to the Mercury missions, and then back to the V1, the V2, the A4 actually. And then Goddard and bottle rockets. So I've got this situation where you start out with a 4th of July bottle rocket, you end up with footprints on the moon, and if you look at it in context and you see the whole picture, you realize that there's no place to insert the conspiracy because because the continuum is so smooth between the bottle rocket and the moon landing that there's no place to insert the conspiracy. The biggest jump, honestly, the biggest jump is between the bottle rocket and Robert Goddard's liquid-fueled rocket. That was the beginning of the space age, 1923, when Goddard launched the first liquid-fueled rocket. You can't get to the moon without a liquid-fueled rocket, and that's when it all began. But from the Goddard rocket to the von Braun's A4, from the A4 to the WAC Corporal, and you're getting staging, and then the A4, the V2, essentially becomes the Redstone, and then you have parallel ICBMs with Atlas and Titan and all the rest of it. The whole thing goes up in a perfectly linear fashion, and there's no place that you can't slip the Joker into that deck anywhere. There's no place to fit it. So that's my actual goal as far as getting people to believe it happened. If you watch the whole thing, you'll realize that there's no place to insert it. Steve Darrow points out it's a disturbingly high percentage of people. I saw something recently posted on Apollo 11. It was some kind of enhanced thing of the landing or something. And the first 25 comments on YouTube were every single one of them was, "I can't believe you believe this nonsense. I can't believe you bought this lie." But this is a better answer than, although it's necessary to debunk all of the stuff that they say. How come the shadows don't match? And how come Buzz Aldrin is, if he's in darkness, he should be pitch black? And these things are so easy to explain. But the one thing that never gets explained ever is the context. I have never heard anything about the moon landing being faked that had anything to do with Apollo 10 or Apollo 12. And Apollo 10 and Apollo 12 also happened. Apollo 11 wasn't magic compared to 10. 12 wasn't magic compared to 11, and on and on and on we go. So, if this whole thing is going to be a conspiracy, at the very least, you'd think we would go once. Why did we go back? Isn't that just another chance to screw things up? Isn't that just another chance to be found out? And then you get to have some fun too. I'll show you the picture because this is worth seeing. Just because I'm on this little roll here. This one I can figure out quickly. It's nice to be able to just go and drag and drop pictures into this software. It is so much better than what we have in the olden days. Which one doesn't work? Sure. All right, I'm going to bring something in here. Hang on. Oi. Let me shrink that puppy down. Oh, I'm shrinking the wrong puppy down. Let me shrink that puppy down. There we go. And let's make this puppy big again. Hooray. Hooray for me. Look who did a good job. But what I want to show you here is the picture. So let me fix my video first. As I said, working with engineers and stuff was a shocking development for me. Is that it? That's it. Yes. Okay, so this is a photograph of the world's largest vacuum chamber. It is the largest vacuum chamber in the world. It's at the space. Where is that? It's part of NASA. It's in Sandusky, Ohio, at the renamed Glenn Research Center. It's in Sandusky, Ohio. Now take a look at this because this is really important. Really important. This structure is the largest structure that we have ever constructed on Earth that was capable of withstanding an actual vacuum. That alone is an astonishing thing to say if you think about it. I mean, it really just is almost inconceivable. But think about it. This structure is what is necessary in order to make a space that is maybe marginally larger than the footpads of the LEM into a vacuum. And you can see from the thickness of the walls and the size of those steel doors that this building has to undergo unbelievable amounts of pressure. And this is one of the things that none of us realize, that we're sitting here walking around and we're sitting there watching dinner or having dinner, and I'm sitting here chatting in the lounge, and I've got some lights on, I'm staring into a camera and all the rest of that stuff. But what we don't realize is that there is about 100 miles of atmosphere on top of us, pressing down all the time. And the reason we don't feel it is because there's atmosphere down here too. It's like if you have a piece of tissue paper, and you were to take a piece of tissue paper and put it in a frame, let's say, and punch your finger through it, no problem. But if you punch your finger through it and at the same time you have another finger punching the same way, then the thing doesn't rupture. So the thing that is for me, not that I need much convincing, but for me, this is the killer. That's the largest vacuum chamber we can make in the world. It has to be incredibly strong because the forces of the atmosphere pressing down are strong enough to cause anything to implode. I've seen dumpsters or those cargo containers just crumple like paper cups if you pull enough air out of the inside of them. But the thing about this that I state, and I really just like very much, I think I'll probably just ditch this now. Yeah, you can go. Go away. Remove. The thing that I, God, the thing that I think is the best evidence, not that I need to convince any of you guys, but the best evidence is if you look at the actual landing, out the window landing from the LEM. If you look at virtually every frame of video, whenever any astronaut is on the surface in motion or when they're coming down to final approach on any of the other 5 landings, you'll see something. Neil and Buzz looked out the window and they saw something, before they landed on the moon, they saw something no one had ever seen before, ever. And that's really kind of blew my mind when I realized it. No one had ever seen what they were looking out at the window about a minute before they landed. and what they were seeing was dust, but it wasn't a dust cloud. People think, oh, there's dust, we can't see. It's not like a billowy cloud came up. Dirt was flying out from underneath the LEM exactly like water. And if you want to think of how the dust behaves, the best way to think about it is taking a high pressure garden hose with one of those jets on the front, and then just pointing it straight down in concrete and letting it go. The dust just goes flying out in all directions at these incredibly high speeds. If you you can't make dust behave like that unless it's in a vacuum. Look at all of the stuff on the Apollo 11 moonwalk. Every time any one of the astronauts moves their feet, you'll see the dust will go in a little spray, just like it's water. It's exactly like it's water. And it just sprays, doesn't go up, doesn't get dusty, sprays. And by the time you get to the rover, it's just everywhere. So you can't make dust do that unless it's in a vacuum. You can't you just can't do it. It's not possible. There's certainly a long time before computer graphics. It would be much harder, it was impossible to make a computer graphics image or CG in 1969. It wasn't impossible to go to the moon. But my point is that little fly of dust, whenever you look at anything from the moon, you will see the dust behave that way. And that's proof that it's in a vacuum. And the reason I showed you the vacuum facility there is that in order to make a studio big enough to fake the moon landing and to put that studio in a vacuum, it's harder than going to the moon. It's much harder of an engineering challenge. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, then why the hell did we, if this whole thing is fake and it's all done in a studio, why did we include a golf cart that went 20 kilometers? That seems to me like we're pushing our luck a little, don't you think? A studio the size of whatever it takes to run the background and go 20 kilometers. This is the kind of thing. This is how it works. I've been a victim of this kind of thing before. You show people a few points of data. You point out a couple things that seem to be unexplainable contradictions, and you've got them convinced. But if I were to just play just nothing but say, oh, the moon landing's a fake, and all I were to do is say, okay, and I just ran 5 minutes of Apollo 17, not 11, 17. You'll ask yourself, well, I see the craters, and they keep on going, and they keep on going, and they keep on going, and the dust is doing all this other stuff. Where the hell did they film this? And you don't even have to close the argument. There it is. So there's something about it. I'd like to get people's comments actually on what they think, what drives this emotionally. I have some theories, but I'd like to read a few comments live from people, some insight into what they think drives people to vehemently deny that the moon landing ever occurred. So I've got a couple of theories, and I think they're all of them. Postmodern denialism, it's a great term. Lord Bios, I just don't know what it means. Being in the know instead of a rube. You got it, Steve. You got it. It's being in the know. It's secret knowledge. It's the sense that you are smart and everybody else is stupid. You're not one of the sheeple who bought into this this fiction. It's a sign that you're not only smarter than everybody else, but you're also in on something. You're on a smaller group. I'm looking at all of it. And people thrive on conspiracy. Right. It's wanting to be seen as different. That's really it, And a not 47 yet said people need to feel significant so they can claim to be knowledgeable. That's what it is. It makes them feel sophisticated. It makes them feel knowledgeable. It makes them feel like they are above everybody else. It makes them feel higher than they are. And this is the entire zeitgeist of the modern age is, how do I find a way, now that everybody has a voice on the internet, how do I find a way to make people realize I'm smarter than everybody and better. This is progressivism in a nutshell. And no wonder they hate the moon landing. Somebody pointed out to me once that one of the reasons they think that millennials are so, that the number of moon landing deniers, such a high percentage of them are young people, is because millennials have been raised, not through any fault of their own, that to believe that they were the most special people ever, and everything they did was a gold star, and every piece of art they ever did had to go not only on their refrigerator but in a museum, and they've been told that they're the smartest, best educated, most amazing, indigo-auraed people in the history of the world, and now they're confronted with the fact that their grandfathers did something that is absolutely beyond their ability. Not just beyond their ability to do, beyond their ability to imagine. The complexity of Apollo, the mission, the complexity of the mission can be understood if you have somebody decent who knows how to explain it. But needless to say, when you get down to the engineering and all the valves and all the rest of that stuff that had to happen, it's an army. But the actual explanation of the mission is it. And Kulak 76 says we came home because we got bored. I think the coolest thing I ever heard about the moon landing, about the Apollo program, it wasn't my favorite thing. It wasn't inspiring. I just thought it was interesting. Somebody once said, America is such an amazing country that we got bored with going to the moon. That's really pretty much it. You know, we got bored with going to the moon. We did it. And we got bored with it. And I would like in the future, I'm going to continue, needless to say, it's not just obligations, my obligation and my great pleasure is to produce 12 shows a week here at BillWhittle.com. I don't know if anything else is going to happen with that said. I'd like it to. But even if it doesn't, what happened? What happened? It's like the country got shot. It's almost like the country, it's like America was driving down the streets of Dallas in a convertible and then boom, gone. And what happened? I don't know. I know that most of the people who are, associates and friends and stuff of BillWhittle.com and Stratosphere Lounge, I know they all think the way I do at least about these things. And I know a lot of people from the space age, and they're pretty much tremendously successful people. And I hasten to add, there are a number of people out there, not a huge number, but a number of people out there who were not born during or grew up during the space age who have that right stuff. Now, Steve Darrow says Saul Alinsky happened. Yes and no. I'd really like to get people's opinion on this. Yes, Saul Alinsky happened. And there's no question about that. But Saul Alinsky and his book were just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of books written by, bitter lunatics. Why is it that Saul Alinsky, why the Saul Alinsky form of this progressivism, why did that take root? Why? Was it Vietnam? I just genuinely don't know. It's just really, it's just hard. Some people here are saying they have friends who work at SpaceX. I have a friend whose son works at SpaceX. And that's going to be the final hope that I'm going to end this series on. Sorry about the vision. ELB grad says it all changed after the JFK assassination. I disagree. Kennedy was assassinated in 63. We were just starting to get our feet underneath us at 63. We really didn't hit our stride. I mean, Jim and I was an amazing program. It's fun to talk about that because nobody really talks much about the Jiminy program. But we landed on the moon in 69. And I don't know how this is related. I just have a feeling that it is. It's a very trivial thing, but it's something, I can't put my finger on it. But I somehow feel it's connected, and I'd like to hear people's comments on this, and then we'll get on with the questions. You watch Mission Control during Apollo 11, and you'll see what you're used to seeing. You'll see guys with like button-down short sleeve shirts. Everybody's wearing a tie. Everybody's got pocket protectors for their pens. Then watch Mission Control, not for the shuttle or anything. Just look at the guys in Mission Control for Apollo 17. 2.5 years later. If you look at the mission control from Apollo 17, you're going to start seeing the big wide sideburns, and you're going to start seeing the big wide lapels, and you're going to start seeing something happening that wasn't there before. And needless to say, it's ugly, as James Lilacs, who we talked about last week, I guess it was, said. The 70s were the wide decade. But seriously, now I really think something connected here. I don't know what it was, but if you look at the guys on Mission Control for 17, they just what had happened to the Mission Control by 1972, even the space guys at Mission Control and NASA had been touched by the 60s, and when I say the 60s, I mean the late 60s, because most of the 60s was Neil Armstrong, clean cut, science nerds. When people say the 60s, what they're usually talking about is 1967 to maybe 72, 73. But somehow, and it's not obvious, it's not hard to figure out how, somehow that kind of rolling around in the mud doing acid at Woodstock 60s started to work its way into the we choose to go to the moon 60s. And if the clothes were changing, then attitudes were changing too, somehow. And that's a big mystery to me that I'd like to explore in the future. Because whatever it was, you can see it. Kulak 76 points out that Neil Armstrong was an Eagle Scout. One of the great things about being able to do this is I get to talk a little bit about the kind of person Neil Armstrong actually was. I thought First Man was just appalling. I just thought it was just a genuine criminal insult. But just to give you an idea about what kind of man this guy Neil Armstrong was, Kulak 76 said Neil Armstrong was an Eagle Scout. He was an Eagle Scout, but what many people don't know is that Neil Armstrong, after he came back, personally wrote a letter to every single Eagle Scout that the Boy Scouts graduated. He wrote a letter to every single one of them in his own hand, congratulating them on becoming Eagle Scouts. And he did this for years and years and years. And it wasn't until he found out that people were scamming people by forging his signature that he stopped doing it. But, think about this. This is the guy. I wouldn't say exactly the most famous guy in history, but his name will be around longer than anybody that we can think of. He wrote a personal letter to every single Eagle Scout congratulating them. That's something in there. And this is the thing I'm trying to get my fingers on working forward, is what ingredients were there and what changed. Why was that time so effective in the things that we value? And certainly the people out there, smoking dope right now don't value these same things as we do. But what changed in our culture? Here's something else you may not have known about Neil Armstrong, Kulak, who brought up the Eagle Scout thing. Armstrong got along with everybody. He never, ever took credit for anything. He was always the first guy to say that this was a product of 100,000 people working in an entire nation footing the bill. But as it turns out, there may have been more, but the only one I'm aware of. As it turns out, Neil Armstrong only ended up suing one person in the course of his entire life. Anybody want to guess who that person was? Blew me away. The only person that Neil Armstrong ever went to court over regarding his status as first man on the moon. You ready for this? The person he ended up suing was his barber. because his barber was selling locks of his hair and made $3,000 off of it. And it wasn't even that so much that bothered him. It bothered him that he found out that other people were selling so-called locks of Neil Armstrong's hair and defrauding people of a lot of money. Armstrong basically said to the barber, "You made how much off of this? $3,000. A lot of money for a while there." And he said, "You are going to repay all of that. You're going to give the money back to the people who got my hair." And the guy said, "Well, I don't have it. I spent it." He said, "Well, then you can start working on it. And that's what you're going to do." And that's what he made him do. I don't want to say it's inconceivable to me. It's actually the opposite of inconceivable to me. It's how you should behave. This is what I would expect anybody to do. This is the kind of behavior I expect out of human beings. He just wouldn't tolerate it. He wouldn't. And he would give autographs until he realized that people were being defrauded out of hundreds or thousands of dollars by faking his signature. And I know that story from another amazing connection. I heard that story about Neil and the autographs when I was working on my airplane. You know, I actually have a hard time even just saying it. I heard that story at lunch after Mike Melville, the first private citizen in space. He wasn't the first civilian, but the first private citizen in space, Mike Melville, told me that story at lunch after he helped me work on the engine on my Long Easy. He had met Neil a number of times, and he said he ended up having Neil sign something for him twice, which he volunteered to do, and that's how he found out about the whole thing because a Neil Armstrong signature in his later years was a heck of a thing to have. So, since I still have a polished draft to do on the actual Apollo 11 thing, I like talking about this stuff now. It gives me a chance to exercise some ideas and get some feedback. But and this isn't to take anything away from him. But that was Neil Armstrong. But that wasn't Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin would open a 7-Eleven if you came up with a couple $100, you know. I don't like bad-mouthing Buzz. And I don't mean to be bad-mouthing him, and God knows that poor man has had enough comparisons to Neil Armstrong in the course of his life. But I also know a number of people who have spent a lot of time working with Buzz Aldrin in his later years, you know. And he's just not the same guy at all, not even close. You know, Buzz is the kind of guy who will sign something for you if you put the $100 on the table or whatever it happens to be. And you can tell because Buzz has had a number of facelifts. The idea of Neil Armstrong getting a facelift, it's like Abraham Lincoln getting a facelift. No. Buzz has had a couple of them done, and he has that kind of, pardon the expression, he's got that kind of rocket sled look, you know. And you can see, I saw a picture of Neil, Mike Collins, and Buzz Armstrong. I guess they were talking in the White House with President Obama. And Neil looks like a man in his 80s, and Mike Collins looks like a man in his 80s, and Buzz Aldrin looks like a man in his 80s who's had his skin blasted with sandpaper to make him look like a guy who's in his 80s who had his face resurfaced. Buzz, by all accounts, was not a pleasant guy, but Buzz, Buzz, they called him Dr. Rendezvous. He could do the orbital mechanics in his head. And Buzz was also the guy, we had some problems on our first spacewalks, nothing like Leonov's problem. He nearly was killed. But we had some disorientation, and Buzz, who was a scuba diver, just a recreational scuba diver, said, "Well, why don't we train for this?" He said, "How are you going to train for zero G?" And he said, "Why don't we do it underwater?" That was Buzz. But Buzz, you couldn't have gotten there without Buzz. But he was a completely different guy. Now, I have heard anecdotally, and I'm going to look into this because I've still got another day or two before I have to turn this thing in. But I have heard in a couple different places that Buzz was extremely driven by a father, a very distant, emotionally remote father, and and I have heard that basically when Buzz met his dad for the first time after landing on the moon, this can't possibly be true, but if it's not true, it's got the feel of truth to it. He met up with his dad after he'd come back from the moon, and his dad looked at him and he said, "So, second? Really?" When I was very young, I want to say I was probably 15 or 16, working at the Miami Planetarium, and Buzz came in. We had some moon rocks out in display. Buzz came in, and I shook his hand briefly. He's kind of a smaller guy. But when people were talking about Buzz, I was 14 or 15 years old, and I'd heard that he'd had enormous bouts of depression, had a serious drinking problem and stuff. It's my first real connection to these kind of adult sort of problems. And I think it was my friend Phil who said, I must have said something along the lines of, wow, hey, Warp Factor, when you say yes, he did, does that mean that story's actually true? Anyway, so somebody said, I think it was Phil said, he said, well, Bill, what do you think? I mean, how would you feel? You've spent your entire life working towards something, and I know how much you want to go, and let's just imagine that you did that. Oh, punching. No, the punching's for sure, for sure. I saw that. How would you feel if you're 38 years old and you've landed and you've walked on the moon? What are you going to do now? I remember thinking, wow, that's a question. That's a real question. What do you do when you're 39 years old and you walked on the moon? What now? I imagine life would be a bit anticlimactic after that, personally. That would be my thought about being an Apollo astronaut. But that softened the blow a little bit. Look, the great thing about Apollo, and of course there's Mike Collins, who's the enigma. I mean, he's just Mike. There's like a cardboard cutout shape where Mike Collins stands, and not just compared to Neil and Buzz either. They're just in general. I could tell you a bit about Dave Scott. I could tell you about Gene Cernan. I could tell you about Jim Lovell. I could tell you about Frank Borman. But Mike Collins is just an enigma. He's just he's the only guy I think in the entire program that struck me as somebody who really wasn't an astronaut. They really didn't belong there. But of course, he deserved it and he earned it too, and all the rest of it. Yeah, Woody Fool mentions Brian Regan's talk about the dinner party. If you haven't seen it, Google Brian Regan, Regan. I walked on the moon. It's just make you cry funny. I did not read Carrying the Fire. I suppose I should. Okay. Anyway, let's get on with the show. So anyway, I'm very excited about this, and an idea was floated earlier that I wrote down, and the idea was, what if I were to keep that set and that 60s costume and report on today's news as if it were 1969? Because I've already started to build a little bit of backstory for this thing. And every time I think about it, I build a little bit more. Almost like that I'm broadcasting from Apollo, from the backup control room of Apollo program, the one buried deep inside, not Cheyenne Mountain, because everybody knows where it is, It's a little chamber that's 2 miles inside of some undisclosed mountain in the Rocky Mountains. But but I went down there in 1969 and heard a few noises, and I have not been up since. It's still 1969 down there. We'll show you one more time just because I want to show off the incredible work that they did here. Is it? Oh, sorry, it's you. And Jackass Flats. That's tempting. That's tempting. But the idea, and this is what I've been struggling with, just kind of blabbing for the last hour. The idea that I could use this picture frame to be kind of the voice of the space age, and look at what's happening in the world today from that perspective. I just think that's a freaking grand idea. I really do. And again and again and again, I keep coming back to, oh, well, that was all just a fantasy. It was all just a dream. It was just, you're deluded. You grew up with it like everybody else. And then I just have to stop myself. We did it. We went 6 times. We got bored. Reason I'm pissed off is not even because of moon landing conspiracy guys. I'm pissed off because I'm not broadcasting this show from Ganymede. That's why I'm pissed off. This show should be coming to you from the moons of Jupiter or a Mars base or something. That's the thing that pisses me off, and we could have done it. We did it. I don't know what failed, but honestly, if you look at the space age and everything that got achieved by not just by NASA but everything in that period. If you look at that, and you look at that as part of American history, it's honest to God like watching a rocket go right off the pad and then just start hovering, and then just slowly slide back down and go boom. It's like just didn't make it, just didn't have escape velocity. It didn't happen. Dave Big Boutte mentions we went to the moon 9 times. That's correct. We went on Apollo 8, Apollo 10, no lander on 8, lander on 10 but didn't land. We went 8, 10, 11 landed, 12 landed, 13 went to the moon and came around again, 14 landed, 15, 16, 17 all landed. And we had, Apollo 20 was a little up in the air, but 18 and 19, they're just ready to go. They're ready to go. Can you imagine being somebody like Fred Hayes, who is the lunar module pilot, I think, on 13, and he's been given command of Apollo 18 or 19, one of those two. So you had to sit there and watch the moon go by and make it back home, and you don't get to land on the moon, but you can go back again as commander in Apollo 19 or 18. And then somebody has to call you and say, Freddie, mission's been scrubbed. Why? What failed? We did is what failed. That's what failed. Martin Archer says he wants to ask his Apollo question now. Why don't you ask it now, Martin, and then I'll do an hour from the comments. I'm still trying to catch up on sleep, so fire away. And we're just going to do that one from the live stream, and then we'll go over to BillWhittle.com. But anyway, I'm very, very excited about this. Yeah, that's what it was. Congress failed. That's a lot of it. He's typing. No problem. Take your time. That idea is still alive. I was talking with Natasha about this earlier today. It's almost like if that set is a bomb shelter or a bunker or something like that. I like the idea that the spirit of space age, spirit of Apollo, went down into this mountain, and it's still there, and somebody is keeping the flame. Makes me feel an awful lot like that knight at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. You know, it's like somebody's got to guard this thing, this idea. Um, and anyway, yeah, that's a great point. Dave Big Boutte says the component with the highest failure rate in all of manned spaceflight prior to 2015 was Congress. And it's tempting to use that. That's very, very good. Okay, here we go. Alan Bean, Ed Mitchell, Jim Irwin, Charlie Duke, Jack Schmidt. What two things do they all have in common? They're all lunar module pilots. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Right? They're all lunar module pilots. Is that the answer? That's their official designation. Schmidt was a geologist. Oh, and, okay, so they were all lunar module pilots. That's a great question. Was that their first mission? Is that what they had? No. Yeah. First mission? I saw Alan Bean, Conrad. Yeah, it was their first mission. Did I get it right? I think they were all first timers. Is that it? It is. Yep. They were all lunar module pilots. They all went to the moon. They all landed on the moon, and none of them had flown in space before. How about that? Isn't that something? That's a great, great, great piece of trivia. I never knew that. Thank you, Martin. That's going to find its way into the script. That's amazing. I was looking at Project Mercury, and I was looking at what the requirements for Project Mercury was. We got 7 astronauts out of that. 6 of them flew. Well, 7 of them flew, but 6 of them flew Mercury capsules. And that's the statistic. I always get it wrong. I'm going to copy it down now so I can get it right. This is the crime of the age right here. No one born after 1935 has been to the moon. Born after 1935. What the heck was I saying? Huh. Now it's gone. It'll come back to me. All right, let's do some questions, and then I can head home here. Oh, it's fun to see at BillWhittle.com. There's a bunch of people comments here. I got to be watching those a little more closely in the future. But I do have the page that was set up by Scott Ott, which I love, by the way. And here's what Scott wrote on BillWhittle.com on the entry for questions for Stratosphere Lounge 6 2019. Scott wrote, post your questions for Bill Whittle in the comments below for possible inclusion in Thursday night's Stratosphere Lounge live stream, also available on Twitch TV. And then below that he says, the management makes no claims or assurances that Mr. Whittle will use your question, nor that his answer will directly address your query without veering wildly in a predetermined or entirely spontaneous direction. The state of California has determined that the Stratosphere Lounge and its hosts contain trace and or saturation amounts of several chemical and biological compounds determined to have a carcinogenic, cardiothoracic, or psychotropic effects on laboratory animals, which, of course, were not harmed during the making of the Stratosphere Lounge, and were determined by a panel of micro-expression analysts to have given implied consent for their service. That's comedy writing there, buddy. That's just bloody marvelous. I'd like to have that on every single one of them. That should be our byline. That should be on the T-shirt. Let's see. Okay. So we are now at BillWhittle.com. We're looking at the very special comments page here, and I'm going to get as much of these done as I can. Very tired, but I'm glad to be doing them from the from the members page here. So Chip writes, does our overall digital dinner table conversation suffer from the lack of a common Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley to which to base debates and conversations? Damn, how old does that make me sound? Yeah, me too, pal. Back in the day, several generations had a common source to base their discussions on, albeit they were leftist, and now every small faction has their own sources, making it almost impossible to have thoughtful communications among individuals, much less generations. Excellent point, Chip. And I would go further than that. We not only don't have common Cronkites or Huntley Brinkleys, we don't even have Gilligan's Island or Love Boat or Friends. There is no longer, once the internet came along as a primary means of entertainment, really once cable started to really take off in the 80s, we no longer have a common culture in terms of our common experience. We all, no matter what you thought about it, we all had those shows. I remember hearing, thank you, Lisa says, well, we all have the Stratosphere Lounge. True enough. And pretty soon our viewership live will be greater than that of CNN's. But I think the second essay I wrote on Eject, Eject, Eject started off with a story that I had heard about American tourists in Paris, Chip. And the story was that this guy, American tourist, was walking down the Champs-Élysées or something, and he saw a crowd of people over in the corner, and you could hear some music, and he went over there, and turns out there was a guy with a guitar, and he was singing the Ballad of Jed Clampett. And there were 25 or 30 Americans around him, and they were all singing, and then he did the Gilligan's Island theme, and people had tears in their eyes because it's home. Now, I know what my intellectual and moral betters in the school of existentialism down at Café Sartre would have to say about that. But there's something really kind of beautiful about that, actually. And we all became, there's not a person out there. I've done this test. I've done it at least 50 times live. When I talk about the power of entertainment and how it not only binds us together, but how we're basically hypnotized into all of these things, I've said, I'm going to start a sentence and you're going to end it for me. That's how sure I am about this. And I look out there and I say, okay, here we go. Ready? Look, up in the sky, it's a bird. And everybody in unison, instantly, it's a plane, it's Superman. These are things that we all had in common as a culture, and we don't have them anymore. And that's not just a problem in terms of conservatism. That's a problem in terms of just a commonality of pop culture to share. It's a serious issue. You're absolutely right. It's a great question. Okay, moving on. Troy Stevens. Hey, Troy. I got two of them here. Have you had any further thoughts about decentralization or building parallel institutions as alternatives to progressive-dominated strongholds? It's hard to know where to start with this, but it seems like an important idea that I'd like to be involved in and contribute to. Thank you. This kind of takes me back to the whole common sense resistance thing. And the idea of non-hierarchical structures. I think to answer your question directly is to say that's where we're going, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. And on balance, I think it is overwhelmingly a good thing. Overwhelmingly a good thing. Progressive-dominated institutions are vertical institutions. they are structured, and they have to be structured because they're collectivists. What's the point of being able to tell people what to do if there aren't any people to tell what to do? So even something, as kind of as straight out capitalist as the General Motors in the 1960s, it was extremely vertical. You started in the mailroom, you worked your way up. You became a vice president. You retired at 65. They gave you the gold watch. You had your heart attack at 67, and that's basically it. So that vertical structure can be controlled by the people in the boardroom. But what can't be controlled are individuals who are connecting to perform specific tasks and then dissolving back into the soup so that they can recombine with other individuals to perform other tasks. The society we're heading into, and I think this is great because, again, there's nothing the progressives can do to control this, and furthermore, I think this is inevitable. We're moving into a world where it's like an amino acid soup, and all of these proteins assemble themselves basically in order to accomplish this task, and then they dissolve again, and that's kind of sad, but at the same time, it's not. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. I will tell the buckhead story. I was working on a show that I liked very much when I was back with a TV editor, and it was just one of those shows where everybody was just great. Everybody was fun. Everybody got along. Everybody had a good time, and we did that show for about a year, I guess. And then it got canceled, and so we had our wrap party, and it was for all of us really the most fun show we'd ever worked on, and we were feeling pretty sad about it. Some people were crying. Not me, of course. I was just staring steely-eyed off into the distance. But the production manager said something, and I never forget it. He said, "Hey, guys, don't be sad. We're all going to work together again, just not at the same time." That's showbiz. And that is where the entire society is heading. It's heading to a world of gigs. And so gigs is in like a musical job, not as in gigabytes, because we're way past the world of gigs now. We're past the world of terrors too, as well. So the buckhead story. So this is the world that's coming. It's not the world that's coming. It's here. I saw it happen in 2004, and you probably saw it too. I've said it a few times on the show. It bears retelling because it is so important. And I'll make it quick. In 2004, CBS News, as an October surprise to ruin George Bush's chances of re-election, ran a story about George Bush being AWOL from the Texas Air National Guard. And the smoking gun evidence was a memo that looked like a memo from 1967. I mean, it was aged, and did I say 60 Minutes? It was 60 Minutes. Sorry, it wasn't CBS News. 60 Minutes, and they produced a memo, and the memo basically, I think the header was CYA for Cover Your Ass, and basically the letter was written from the point of view of his commanding officer, noting that he was away without leave, and that he didn't know whether he should report it or not because his father was so powerful. And this was the smoking gun that George Bush was AWOL. And everybody in the comments section here is a bit ahead of me because most of us know the story, but if you haven't heard it. So this was their evidence, and this was going to do a lot of damage, especially since John Kerry was the opponent, and Kerry was making himself out to be a war hero, and the whole story behind that would take the rest of the year, but needless to say. And And so this was pretty damning and potentially very, very damaging to George Bush about 3 weeks before the election. So that's what CBS did. And then CBS made a very, very big mistake. Very big mistake. They posted that memo on their website as proof that that this were true. That was a big mistake. Within an hour or so, a commenter on Free Republic named Buckhead took a look at this memo and said, "Well, isn't that odd?" Isn't what odd? Well, this memo is supposedly typed in 1967, but I forget what George Bush's squadron was. Let's just say the 1176th. Okay, whatever, 1148th. It was typed in 1967, but it says here, referring to the 1148th Tactical Fighter Squadron, whatever it was, it's got the 48 and then the TH is just, 48th. Yeah. Well, typewriters didn't do that. When you were typing on a typewriter, you had to write 48 and then the letter T and the letter H. How did this thing get kerned up there like that? And then everybody went, oh, now, wait a minute. Charles Johnson, who ran Little Green Footballs, a total champion for justice, and then I guess he just hit a rock or something. One of his bike tours, he's gone barking mad. Really insane. But once somebody pointed out this thing that wasn't seen because it was so common, we're so used to it now. It's what word processors do. It's just automatic. You type it in and it just changes it automatically. Once somebody pointed that out, Charles Johnson looked at the memo, printed it out from the web, got on Microsoft Word in the default settings. He opened Microsoft Word. He didn't change any of the margins. He didn't do anything. And he typed out the memo, word for word, and he printed it out, and they were absolutely identical. And then Charles Johnson did a GIF of here's the claimed original, and here's the one that I just printed out a word. And while the original had letters that were kind of a little degraded and dirt on it and stuff because it was aged, it was artificially aged to make it look real, it's no question that it had been typed into Microsoft Word. These idiots, this is why the left is failing and is going to fail because they really don't understand that we are not the idiots they make us out to be, but there are idiots in the room. It's just not the conservatives. And so once that happened, all hell broke loose. First of all, CBS said that the White House was coordinating this effort. And I'm pretty sure that the White House had nothing to do with coordinating this effort. The White House could not have coordinated the effort because the White House wasn't smart enough to coordinate this effort. The level of the White House intelligence was at about the same level as the level of intelligence at 60 Minutes. What was happening in real time was far, 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 far beyond any second wave, top-down vertical institution could ever possibly keep up with. So now there's a smoking gun evidence, all right, but it's smoking gun evidence against Dan Rather, who basically ran this thing on national television, this assassination attempt, and now, not to say just egg on his face, but nevertheless, So Rather and CBS doubled down. Here's the best part of the story. Dan Rather and CBS doubled down on this. Rather says the document is absolutely authentic. And somebody says, well, there were no, you can't do this on a typewriter. And then CBS and Rather said, not true at all. Turns out that there was a typewriter that did this kind of kerning kind of thing and superscripts and stuff, not kerning, superscript. And it turns out it was like a $7,000 or $8,000 IBM machine that did typesetting, 1967, don't forget. It did typesetting and is capable of doing that. Forget the fact that it came out in Microsoft Word default settings. So that begs the question, why this remote fighter wing of the Texas Air National Guard, a memo written in a Quonset hut probably someplace in 1967. Why is it that that major in a military base have a $7,000 typewriter at his desk in 1967? I mean, when you say that, I think I really do think that when they made that claim, when CBS made the claim or offered that up as an argument, I know they were in a panic, but I don't think they were. I think they were in such a panic they did not realize just how unbelievably damning this is. Okay, so people are laughing this out of the courtroom. Okay, so some guy in the Air Force National Guard has a $7,000 typewriter to write memos about, and nobody else in the entire military has one of these. Why? It's absurd on its face, and everybody knows it. It's just ridiculous. And then somebody said, no, the IBM selector could do it. If the IBM selector did this, this, and this, you could get it done if you changed the ball or something like that. As if this major who's writing a memo to himself is going to get to the 168th stop, remove the selectric ball, put the other one in there with the different type TH, and then pull that off again, get the other one. This is the level of desperation they were reaching to. But he said, but the IBM selector could do it. And then this is the part I'll never forget as long as I live. I don't remember where I saw it. Probably it was Little Green Footballs. But somebody came up and said, no, the IBM selector can't do that. It's not capable of doing what you said it did. On some sort of public forum about this. It might have been the CBS forum. And they said, well, how the hell do you know? I was on Free Republic. Thanks, Steve. And he said, well, the reason I know that the IBM selector couldn't do it is because I was the chief engineer of the IBM selectric. I was in charge of building that typewriter. And that's just... So what happened? What did we see? What was actually happening? What was actually happening was individuals working on their own, looking at the same problem, brought their unique experiences and perspectives to the problem, put them all in a box, and in the space of just a couple, as I remember, it was most a day, utterly destroyed the argument. Utterly. And when it was over, these guys didn't get together and drink beers, and they weren't hired as a think tank or anything. They weren't even looking for the story. I'm wandering through the internet. Here I am. Look at that. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, that's not true about the selectric. I was the engineer on this. And so they found themselves. And then when that task was finished, once CBS looked as idiotic and frankly as criminal as they did and do, and Dan Rather was ruined, which couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Once that happened, that molecule just fell apart back into atoms, back into its individual proteins. It just simply fell apart. And those pieces didn't get destroyed. They just went back into the soup to connect with other things. And that is the age we live in now. One example that I've talked about a lot, and I am very tempted, honest to God, I am so tempted to just run it once during the Stratosphere Lounge, but I won't put you through that. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Go to YouTube and look up a guy who's just brilliant, really funny, named Internet Historian. Great narration. He's got this fantastic accent. He's very, very dry, very, very funny. But look up Internet Historian. And he's got 4 different episodes called, what is it, HWNDU. Windu is it, for He Will Not Divide Us. And I have to remember what episode it is. I'll post a link for it next time. But basically, when Trump was elected, Shia LaBeouf decided as a protest that he was going to put a live webcam on the streets of New York, and people could just come up to it and comment about how awful Donald Trump was, and saying he will not divide us. And he had T-shirts printed up. That was his slogan that Shia LaBeouf came up with. He will not divide us. And so people were coming in and they were talking about, well, Trump's a Nazi and Trump's this and all of that. And then, and the left still doesn't understand this. They never understand it. They're too stupid to understand it. People started making comments on that webcam that were so obviously provocations. They were so obviously trolling people. But Shia LaBeouf not only believed it, he 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 actually assaulted a guy because I think the guy came up to the camera and said Hitler didn't do anything wrong. If you can't smell that is trolling from a guy who's just the guy's not a skinhead or anything. They had and he I think he just hit him. I think he got arrested. So anyway, so Shia shuts down the webcam on the New York City street, and then he puts it someplace else. And then 4chan finds it in 37 hours or something like that. The one I remember, because it was by far to me the most compelling one, was so then Shia LaBeouf sets up a webcam where he's got the "He Will Not Divide Us" flag. It is flying on a flagpole. The camera is outside. It's against the sky. There's absolutely no way to know where it is. It's just in the middle of nowhere. And so Shia LaBeouf figured, no, I've got them now. They'll never find this, obviously. This story is so amazing. It's actually the most amazing. This is such an important story. It seems so trivial, but it's not. It's not. It is so important. So he's flying this flag, and there's a webcam on the flag, and you really have to hear this guy, internet historian, describe, because his narration is just masterful, and the video work is terrific too. Basically, what he says is, he said, all right, so there's a live webcam. So 4chan, which certainly has negative things to be said about 4chan as well, but I admire the general overall attitude. I can't endorse every single individual on it, but I sure do love their attitude as a general rule. So 4chan, who are the guys who basically were taking offense at this whole Shia thing, and which tells me, I'm sure they're not conservatives, but they certainly seem libertarians. So all the 4chan guys who do nothing but stay on the internet all day, they refer to themselves as weaponized autism, another genius term, which is self-deprecating humor, and therefore a sign of not only intelligence but wisdom. Now they had a problem. Where is this flag? They were determined to beat Shia LaBeouf, and as a group of guys with unbelievable IQs. They're 160 plus for sure. People who are too smart for the world, too smart to go out in public. They just don't belong. They just don't fit. So these guys started looking at the problem, and then, as internet historian points out, telling the story, he said, "Well, first of all, it's a live webcam, so they notice that the sun is going down, and they check their watches." And they realized that, okay, it's Eastern time zone. Sun's going down. It's live. It's got to be in the Eastern time zone. You've immediately eliminated 3/4 of the United States and the entire rest of the globe. So just by one instantaneous observation, you've narrowed it down significantly to the Eastern time zone. And then a lot of stuff happened, but the part of it that is just mind-boggling is, they've got nothing but a flag against a sky. How the hell do they tell where this flag is? They know it's in the Eastern time zone, but how do they tell? Sorry. Huh. And so as we're watching the live stream, they see a couple of jet contrails up high. The routine kind of gassing of the American people that's ejected from selected commercial airliners designed to poison everybody, and including the pilots and their children down on the ground, but I digress. They see these two contrails up there, and they look at the angle, and they say to themselves, okay, these two planes are here relative to each other. This is happening live. Why don't I go to one of these websites on the internet that show me live air traffic control returns of every single airplane that is in the sky? And doing this, they kind of did a screen grab, and they looked at some candidates, and they thought they found one that really could have been it. And so these guys said, if we're right, if this is the place that we think it is, then at 11:49 tomorrow morning, we should see a contrail coming in this direction, and then 3 minutes later see another one going that way. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. So now they had it within 20 square miles, something like that. They looked at the terrain and things like that. And finally, when they finally got close, the way they finally figured it out was the webcam was not only transmitting video, it was transmitting audio as well. So once they knew about where it was, they had a guy who was in the neighborhood, just happened to be living fairly close to that place in Tennessee. And they had him drive around and beep his horn every 10 seconds or something. And then they sat there and just listened to the webcam. And when they heard the horn, they just keep listening to the beeps, and they say, getting warmer, getting warmer, getting colder, getting colder. And using this simple form of Marco Polo triangulation, walked right up to the flagpole, took a picture of it, and hung a MAGA hat over it or something, and a Pepe thing or something like that. But look, I am not intelligent enough to even seriously break down the problem, let alone solve it. If I was given that challenge, I suppose if my life depended on it and I thought about it for a long time, I could do a little better. But when I heard the story, I said, where on earth did they come up with this? It makes perfect sense after you've heard it, the same way that Shazam makes perfect sense, that app. It identifies the music that you're listening to. The second I saw Shazam work, that's what made me buy the iPhone. Second, somebody demonstrated Shazam in a restaurant, held it up, and it returned what song was playing. The instant that I saw it do it, I knew exactly how it worked. It did a sound recording, sent that back by the cellular network to a computer, compared it to all known recordings, did the match, and did it at high speed and sent back the answer. But could I have ever come up with that app? Not in a million years. So this is open source world. This is the world not that's coming. It's the world we live in, Troy, and it is a world of freedom. There's a freedom, total freedom, and that freedom can often mean some very dark and bad things, including child pornography and rape videos and all the rest of it, animal torture, all of that stuff. But freedom also means you cannot get away with this anymore. You just can't. It's the days of being able to lie and get away with it are over. The same thing happened with Hillary Clinton and all of those pieces of video that people managed to turn up, and guys said she's got multiple, multiple sclerosis? Anyway, you get the idea. Yeah, and Steve Darrow says that's why the free market works. That is why it works. The free market works because this is the stuff that's happening in real time. It is going to, this is why socialism won't win. It can't win. It can't win against this. So there's definitely an upside to that. Here's one that happened to have an interesting response to this, and I understand somebody said don't take them in terms of upticks, think about them in terms of time. I'll try to get to a couple more anyway, and we'll certainly be doing these for them from the member section. So Friday writes, Bill, Dr. Karen Sigmund, president of the American Freedom Alliance, was fired by the private school where she taught. Her crime was espousing the advantage of Western civilization outside the purview of her place of employment. She never brought her views into her classes. She taught math. Meanwhile, there are classes being taught in my high school promoting the ideas of white privilege and Black Lives Matter, where the philosophies of W.E.B. Du Bois are applauded. Booker T. Washington is painted as a submersive schmuck. I know you've given speeches for the AFA. My question to you is this: is it worth it for educators like Dr. Sigmund to push back? I do in little ways, but never enough to make a dent. How hard should conservative teachers buck the system in the hope for a change? By the way, they finally broke me. This will be my last year in public education. I've experienced the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and I'm getting out. Well, you'll be surprised to know, or maybe not, that I had a chance to discuss Dr. Siegmund's case with Dr. Siegmund, who we generally, Natasha and I, see at least a couple times a month socially. We've been friends since the first day of AFN I did for them, and we see each other socially quite a lot. We're very good friends. And we were sitting at Paradise Cove in Malibu. I was drinking one of their rum punch smoothies, pineapple smoothie with rum in it. I know it sounds fruity. I don't care. It's the most delicious thing that God has ever created on this earth. And we were talking about the whole thing with her. And needless to say, it broke her heart. But I think there are two things that will give her some consolation. First of them is that the classes just graduated just a couple days ago. Her class finally graduated. And now that the classes were over and she wasn't teaching anymore, that released a certain amount of constraint and pressure. And Karen received so many letters from her students. The students took her out to dinner, or it was a lunch, I don't remember. But her students took her out, bought her a $60 dinner because they were so outraged by what happened here. Somebody wrote in and said, this is an injustice. You should be ashamed of yourself. And then the principal wrote an email to Karen, including this, saying, see, this is why you can't work here. You generate this kind of hate for the school. So Karen has a couple of, what's the word I'm looking for? I just hate it when I blank out like this. It happens more and more often. Consolations. One of them is that all of her students adore her, wrote letters severely critical of what they're doing, basically said that after the election of Trump in 2016, a number of her students went up and offered their condolences because they were sure that she would have voted for Hillary Clinton because she's a teacher. That's how much she brought her politics into the thing. She spent an entire 2 days with a Muslim student. I forget exactly. I think something happened where the student wasn't able to go someplace or whatever, and he and Dr. Sigmund spent 2 days together working on math and stuff. This is way after the so-called hateful Islamophobic remarks about how the West is amazing and all the rest of it. So one of her consolations is knowing that the kids that she actually taught not only don't buy it, but they're outraged by it, and that outrage will never leave them. That will make them conservatives for the rest of their lives. The other consolation I think she has is that I think she has a superb legal case. I mean, a superb, absolutely top-notch legal case. And it is my hope, and to the degree that I speculate on these things, it's my hope and my expectation that she's going to walk away with a significant sum of money from this. And I hope it's enough money to get that principal fired, because it sounds like what happened was one teacher, one of these communist teachers, saw the event that she did that was not on school campus, had nothing to do with anything, where she uttered the absolutely intolerable provocation of saying that Western civilization was the most amazing civilization in the world, not only because of all the science and culture and everything, but also because it belonged to everybody, that anybody could just buy in. You want to be an American? Come here legally, raise your right hand. Congratulations, welcome to Western civilization. And so one left winger, a teacher, none of the students, a teacher, brought that to the attention of the principal, and the principal, also being a giant left wing hypocrite, murder apologist, decided to fire her. Or technically speaking, not renew her contract. I don't know anything about the details of the case. I'm not speculating on the case. I don't have any inside information on the case, nothing like that. But it is my fond hope, is that she sues them till their ears bleed. I want her to get every single dime out of that school. And Dave Big Booty points out, or Big Boutte, points out that Oberlin had been slapped with a major judgment. More lawyers will be willing to take on lefty colleges. This is something that should have happened a long time ago. And I don't believe in lawfare as something that civilized people do to each other, but we're not dealing with civilized people. Oberlin did this kind of anti-conservative discrimination, won the aggrieved parties won against Oberlin, and it was a big award. I want to say it's 30 million or something like that. Okay, now if Karen's case also goes and wins, what is going to happen is this: if these lawsuits continue to be successful, this is going to slow down, if not stop. It's going to have a serious effect on it, because while all of them will still have their hateful opinions, and the idea that they shouldn't be giving biology students political indoctrination never even enters their head, nevertheless, if it's costing the school $30 million every time this kind of discrimination happens, then the teachers will stop. They'll be told to stop. Bo Monday says that there are rich conservative organizations funding these lawsuits. I hope that's true, because if not, if anybody asked me what I could do with my dollar for the conservative cause out there, I wouldn't even say Bill Whittle membership. I would say if there was a legal fund for this, I would do it. And I would have every conservative student in America with their cell phones on, pointed at the sky just to get the audio. And I'd like to capture everything these people say. And then I'd file like the world's biggest class action lawsuit. And I would say, I would file it as fraud. I'm paying you money so that my kid can spend 50 minutes a day in your class learning biology, and they're not learning biology because they're learning about this person's political views. Plus the lawyers were awarded. Good. Sometimes the good guys win. We're going to see the good guys winning more and more. We are past social. This progressivism is on its way out. It has reached the point because it has to constantly top itself. It's all about victimhood and finding injustice, and this thing has now gotten so far out into outer space that reality is banging a sledgehammer against the face of progressivism every single day. This is just a great example. That guy who said he identified as a woman, and therefore he won. Identified as a woman, felt like a woman, wasn't undergoing any sex change operations or anything. Even if they were taking hormone therapy, they still got a male pelvis. So anyway, the point is, progressives say that we should that girls should be empowered, and the girls should be, that women's sports should not be any differently funded than men. Okay, I think Title IX is a catastrophe, but the idea behind it is a good idea. So you spend 20 years, 30 years talking about how girls and women's athletics are important, and then some guy comes along who says he feels like a woman, and so because he feels like a woman, he's allowed to run in the women's category, and then he beats the biological women by something like 2 seconds in the 400 meter, which is usually won by a tenth of a second or something. And now what happens? They can't do the rational, logical thing. Not only because they're incapable of it, but because in this case it violates everything they believe in. The rational thing would be to say, well, look, while we completely support your ability to go through a free society and identify yourself any way you want to, the fact of the matter is you were born with a Y chromosome, and if you want to believe you're a woman and be treated as a woman, I'm fine with that. But you have not only do you have Y chromosome and male muscle mass, most importantly, you have a male pelvis, which can be determined by x-rays by anybody in the entire world who's a medical doctor. I can tell you that, man or a woman, and that mechanical advantage of the build of that pelvis allows you to win these races, and it doesn't matter how much hormones you're taking or any of the rest of that nonsense. So this is where they are now. And the beautiful thing about it is they can't go backwards. And so here's what's happening. Cheryl just pointed out that female track athletes are starting to sue. Good. I'll tell you what the most disgusting thing I've seen in terms of just cruelty and intimidation and brainwashing. The cruelest thing I've seen, and I've seen it several times now, is not watching these guys talking about how they feel good about being able to run, the way they feel. The cruelest thing by far is not, the cruelest thing is not even watching female athletes crying. That alone is hard to watch, and that's very sad and very tragic, and my heart goes out to them. But that's not the cruel thing. The cruel thing is watching these young women force themselves to say, oh no, I'm just very happy for her. What she's doing is very, very brave. Forcing themselves to say that. And you can see it on their faces. And you can tell what they're really thinking. You can tell what their parents are really thinking too. But everybody, well, not everybody, but certainly the societal pressure is for them to say, no, it's just a wonderful thing. I'm so happy I could live in a world where a woman who happened to be born a man gets to compete in the gender that they believe themselves to be. So where is this going to go? Well, this is why I think they're finished. I really do. I think this is end game progressivism. Where do you go on this one issue? It can only go two ways, and neither of them are feasible for the left. The sane way would be to say, okay, look, we haven't thought this thing through. I'm sorry if you identify as a woman, but it's just too much of an advantage, and if it hurts your feelings, we're terribly sorry. Because progressivism is all about whoever has the most hurt feelings wins. This guy is a transsexual. That gives him an enormous advantage. Plus, he's black, which gives him an unbeatable advantage. A young black man trying to be a woman, that pretty much is the sweepstakes. And so the feelings of one person with a high victimhood coefficient, I like that term actually. I'm going to have to remember that. Trumps, if you'll pardon the expression, the feelings of 30 million women athletes. So, where does this go? What is the left going to do? Because this is going to continue to happen. Either they reverse themselves and tell these guys, you know what, we got this one wrong. It's not fair to the girls. It's either going to be that, and it's not going to be that, or they're going to continue to support this idea of biological men who either are in transition surgery or have had the surgery or they're in hormone replacement, or in the case of this one guy in high school, just feel like a woman today. And since that is where they're going to end up, then women's athletics is finished. There will not be any women in the Olympics. Not in any. There may be women in the Olympics in areas like shooting, maybe competitive shooting, but anything that requires physical power and speed, there will not be any women in the Olympics. If they decide to keep the women's category will be filled with transgender men. Every one of them. The fastest woman ever, Flojo, I want to say it was 84 Olympics. It might have been a little later, but it was a while ago. Her best time, the fastest that a woman has ever run the 100-meter dash, ever, is routinely beaten by boys in high school and beaten every day by men in college, young men in college, track teams. So this is one of many things that they simply can't avoid. Los Angeles now, as I record this, over the hill, downtown LA, they've documented at least 3 cases of bubonic plague. The Black Death is in downtown Los Angeles because the garbage there has been allowed to accumulate, And because the progressive attitude towards homeless people demands that we accept the fact that this is not their fault, that it's a housing problem, when it's not a housing problem, it's a mental health problem. But they won't admit that, and so these homeless villages, cities. I saw something in Salinas. That's where you're from, isn't it, Lisa, or near there? As we were taking the train out of Salinas, we right up against the train tracks. It wasn't like 10 tents or 20 tents. It was 5 or 6 minutes of tents. It was a homeless city out there in Salinas. And now we have bubonic plague in downtown Los Angeles, second largest city in America, glamour capital of the world. We have bubonic plague in downtown Los Angeles. And we have people who need iPhone apps to avoid stepping in human feces in San Francisco. If you think that this can go on forever, you're wrong. People will continue to leave California, and they'll continue to move to Texas. And they will do that because they're smart, and because they're not so smart, they'll bring California politics with them, but that's another story. But if you think that this can continue, it won't. It won't. San Francisco's, ooh, San Francisco's, very good. Of course, typhus and and all the rest of that stuff. Needless to say, that's there too. So it can't continue, but it has to continue, which is why I have gone from a state of really profound pessimism. No matter how much I try to keep my chin up, it was really kind of like, man, we just got to roll this boulder up the hill one more day, just do it one more day. To really, even the last year or so, even more feeling like that this progressive meltdown is in progress, and we're going to have to pass the socialism so that we can find out what's in it. That's what's going to happen to America. I really believe it. We're going to have to endure progressivism long enough for us to find out what's in it, and then people will see what it's all about, and then they won't put up with it anymore. And meanwhile, deep inside one of the Rocky Mountains at an undisclosed location, this space age spirit of what motivated individuals can do on their own when they decide to get together as free individuals, that evidence is not just a story, it's evidence. And I think it's about time that somebody just got up and started blowing that silver trumpet again, that this wasn't just a different time, it was a better time. It was a better time in every way. There were 60s, in the 60s there was racism. Absolutely right, there was, yes, no question. There's more racism than there is today. Absolutely right. But I never met an engineer or a test pilot or anyone with the intelligence to be working on a space program who ever expressed the slightest whiff of racism. The thing that the progressives don't understand about this space age attitude is they look at NASA and they see that everybody in mission control is white and male. And what they think is that they're only hiring white males, when the truth is they're hiring the best people in the world. And this is certainly the case today, when there are black engineers, women engineers who are at that level, then they will be welcomed into mission control, because mission control and the space age needs the best people we can find. And once again, you're kind of in a spot here if you're a progressive. I know they want to enforce this, and I know that it is possible to pass a law that says that 50% of the engineers at this engineering company must be female. It is possible to pass a law like that. but you can't pass the biology of it. If you have 50% female engineers, you will be forced to take second raters in order to make that quota. Will that change? I don't know. I would like it to be 50%. I honestly would. I want, and needless to say, I think anybody who should have a right to do pretty much anything they want to, as long as they don't hurt anybody else. This idea that we're keeping women out of engineering is kind of nuts. What you hear when people talk about, when you hear women, progressives talking about this, there's not enough women in STEM. Well, why do you think that is? Well, because it's male dominated. But how does that affect things? Well, everybody's just cold and insensitive, and it's all about logic and reason and all of these other things. And they want that legislated away. Somebody said something to me, what was it yesterday? Where was I? Hang on, I got to think about this. Where was I? We were talking about. I was talking to somebody about just these biological differences between men and women, and they said that they were in a classroom, and a young female student raised her hand and said, "No, I'm sorry, Miss Whatever, you're wrong about that. Differences the biological differences between men and women were outlawed in 1973." That's what she said. And they believe it. Where I remember was at a speaking event. We were talking about this. It came up in one of the questions. Like I say, conservative women understand this, and it doesn't threaten them. This modern feminist thing is not a question of equality. They want to, well, legal equality. They will make movies with women leading men into combat, and they can believe that this is going to provide an example so that other women will grow up to lead men into combat. But that's not going to happen. And it hasn't happened, and it won't happen, because biology is biology. I am not saying that there aren't some good female soldiers, but I am saying there's very, very, very few of them, and it's a lie, and they're trying to force this lie down people's throats. And this is where it comes into contact with reality, and reality wins. So we were talking about this, and I said the real danger is that these young women now, as evidenced by this what this millennial girl said, young women do not believe that there's any biological difference between men and women. I've seen more and more and more of these young SJWs getting in the faces of guys and starting to punch them. And they start punching them because they know that they're not aware that they're even not aware of it. They just know it. On some level, they've grown up in a society where men striking women is abomination, and rightfully so. So you see these little nasty, mean-spirited SJWs, start punching guys in the face. And as long as this continues, more and more young girls and women are going to think that it really is a question of, okay, well, I guess we'll get into a fight. And I don't know how that ends. I can't count the number of times I've seen men get just whacked in the face by these women and just keep walking away, keep backing up. And that just simply tells this particular kind of women, gives them more reinforcement, makes them think that the guy's scared of them. When I was talking about this at the event the other day, I said, you don't have to like it, or you don't have to hate it either. The fact of the matter is this. A woman can hit me as hard as she can, and it would be annoying. If I hit a woman as hard as I can, I might kill her. And that's just the way it is. We're bred for combat. We're speaking of myself only, of course, we're just nothing but solid sheet muscle. We're bred for combat. We're good at fighting, and we're good at task problem solving and so on. And you can't do anything about that. So there will be people who will continue to say we need to legislate more women engineers. And then the response to that should be, well, at what point will you begin your engineering training? Well, I'm not saying I want to be an engineer. I'm just saying I'm here to raise awareness of it. And that's when you say, well, it turns out that when it comes to raising awareness of things, women are doing just fine. In fact, I would say they have the market pretty much cornered. I think we need to legislate a law that says there should be 50% of all the men that get into awareness raising ought to be male. It's so one-sided. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I came up with this. I've never heard anyone else talk about it before. But I think really what you get down to is, when you really get down to it, these feminists, when you ask them why, what's going on, you realize that they don't want to be engineers. They want to major in engineering studies. That's what it is. They're not engineers, but they're engineering studies majors, which means they're people that talk about engineers and make social comments about engineers. They can't build a damn thing, but they're determined to tell you that they could if they wanted to. I'm going to do one more from the comments, and then I'll be happy to. I'll do more of these next time. I had a lot to talk about. I want to make sure I'm going to go back and get they're in. My God, it's in chronological order. You can actually make sense out of this. Nope, it isn't. It's jumping back and forth. Well, I'm sorry not to get to all of these. I'll just take this one because I don't recognize the name. You may have a Stratosphere alias, but we'll wrap this one up tonight with this question from Ralph Capera. And he writes, with all of the hullabaloo, I like you already, Ralph. In fact, when I saw the name Ralph, I liked you. Is that a Ron Swanson avatar? I bet it is. Anyway, Ralph writes, with all of the hullabaloo surrounding the adding of citizen to our census and adding in the angst of over gerrymandering of districts, identity politics being the forefront of life, what do you think about Trump coming in with a completely redesigned census form? It would have the following questions. What is your address? How many U.S. citizens live at this address? And that's it. We don't know the ethnic makeup of the country. We can't gerrymander. If we don't know the ethnic makeup of the country, we can't gerrymander, make the whole thing colorblind. Yes, sir. We always talk about stopping things and fighting against things, and this is bad and that's bad, and we believe in individuals and we don't believe in any of this identity politics, and we've always got these negatives. But we need to make it crystal clear. We need to be trumpeting this every day. Conservatives have been calling for a colorblind society for decades. Decades. We think that questions about ethnicity, religion, race, and even name is irrelevant. Scott and I did a Bill Whittle Now about, or maybe it was a right angle. I do lose track sometimes. About computer software that takes police reports and using expert system analysis scrubs any reference to to gender, race, ethnicity, all of it. And so basically they're taking whatever built-in bias, and there is some built-in bias, they're taking it out of the system. And I think that's a great idea. And this should be a torch. We should be carrying this torch, because if we were carrying this torch, we'd put the progressives in a position where they are now. And the position is this: we say that that race shouldn't matter, that everybody should be treated equally, and we think that the way that people should be treated equally is to get rid of all of these racist things on all of these forms and just have it be absolutely colorblind. Well, this applicant, is he black or white? There's no way to tell. We don't know. We have been saying this for 20 years. why is it that the left is so opposed to this? They're opposed to it because the entire idea of identity politics is to lie to people enough to get them so pissed off that they'll vote for you no matter what. And you know, evidence is evidence. If the progressives really want to live in a society where everybody is treated equally, that's certainly what we want. Equality under the law. If that's what your goal is, then why are you so opposed to colorblind census and colorblind application forms and all the rest of it? Why? I'd be looking forward to their answer. What they would probably say is something along the lines of, well, there's been so much injustice done for so many years that that we need to have this racial information so that we can correct this terrible injustice. And then you have to start asking all kinds of questions, not the least of which is, yeah, and sex blind too, Laura, good point. Not the least of which is, how is it that if somebody does something unjust to somebody, harms them without cause, how is it that having somebody else harm somebody else without cause makes that right? If a white person commits injustice against a black person in 1862, then how is it possible that having a black person commit an injustice against a white person make that right? Not only did the white person not commit the crime, but the black person didn't suffer from it. They're saying they suffered from it, but we talked about this quite a bit on one of the shows where I do lose track, especially this week with all the other writing I've had to do. We're talking about it was Scott's segment on Right Angle, which is not out yet because of me. We were basically saying that that we should have a positive message for this. And since I'm behind on getting this thumbnail out for this, and we'll get them all finished tomorrow. But basically, I'll just close with this one little story that I mentioned on that Right Angle show. So I think it's important. My mother's side of the family, my grandfather, my mother's father, was awarded the Order of the British Empire. He was an officer in the Royal Navy. He worked with naval intelligence during and after World War II, and was pretty good friends with Ian Fleming. And I was and continue to be filled with a burning pride about this, really burning pride. And so when my cousin, Jack, who's about my age, decided to look into our family history, which is much easier on the male side just because of the documents and the names, he went back along the male Whittle line, and I think he got back to 1740. And what he found was that all of us knuckle-dragging ridge runners came from northwestern England. That we're all from a town called Wigham. Wigham has, I don't know how many different Whittles there are in the phone book, but it's astonishingly common. And that's because there is the White Hill region right up there, and that's where the name came from. But when he did the genealogy and broke it down, I got to see the names of everybody, and how long they lived and how big their families were and what they did for a living. And we are mill workers and coal miners back to prehistory. And when I first discovered this, I will admit there was a minute, probably more than a minute, when I was like, really? You know, a bunch of coal miners? And then I almost immediately I just completely reversed myself. It's like, again, it's like I said, it's like slap myself in the face, you know? It's like, what's the matter with you, Bill? You know? If you had been descended from a duke and you're sitting here, you know, trying to pull together the money to keep the electric bill on and pay the rent on the studio, that would be a long fall. But you're descended from coal miners and mill workers. And Martin Archer beat me to the punch. And they suffered so that I wouldn't have to. some of the things, strangely enough, Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier, talked about the neighborhood that my ancestors came from and the squalor of that neighborhood in the 1930s, by the way. My family left there in 1915. But the squalor of those housing conditions were the match for any slum in the world at any time in history. Far worse than the conditions on a slave plantation. And if you want to get down to that, it's not like these people could leave. They were not legally owned by the company, that's true, but they couldn't leave. They couldn't just up and go. They they had to do what they had to do, work for these people at whatever they decided to pay them, and they paid them just enough to stay alive. It is a form of economic slavery. It's not the same. I'm not pretending it's the same, but nevertheless. So here's the thing. Once I realized this, in this book, Road to Wigan Pier, he talks about miners, coal miners. And he said some things that I hadn't realized. For example, a coal miner for the first shift would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they would go down the shaft into the coal mine, and this never occurred to me at all. Anybody here ever walk? I mean, some people do more walking than others. You ever walk a mile? A mile's a decent walk. It's not a killer walk by any means, but a mile is, a mile's a walk. When they got to the bottom of the pits, they would have to walk for 2 or 3 miles, hunched over under a 3-foot ceiling to get to where the face of the coal is. And they weren't paid for the time. They weren't paid unless they were chopping coal. They had to walk underground under a 3-foot ceiling, bent in half, for 2 miles to start to work. And the same thing coming home, too. Merlin says that his wife and he walk 2 miles every other day. Well, just as a kick, I'm not trying to be nasty here, but try it bent in half and tell me how that works. And all of these little details that Orwell wrote about, these are the things that bring it to life. He said that a lot of these miners looked like their faces had been tattooed. They almost looked like Maori warriors. And the reason that they look like that was because as they're hitting this coal seam with pickaxe, and by the way, they're working these picks on their knees. They're working a pick for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day on their knees. And what was happening is when they would hit the face of the coal with the pick, these razor-sharp chips of coal would fly off and constantly put little cuts on their faces. And because there was so much coal dust in the air, this coal got into the wound, under the wound, and when the wound healed over, it was a tattoo. It was a subcutaneous pigment in there. And their faces were just streaked with blue-black, which was coal dust that had gotten into the open face wounds that they got every day. And then when they became mill workers, people would say, how could you ever work in a mill, in a cotton mill? I have 3 generations of ancestors who were cotton carders. I've talked about this before, but cotton carding was something you had to do in a cotton mill where they would give a guy a piece of raw cotton, just like a hunk of cotton off of the bale. And I had 2 or 3 generations of grandfathers who had like wooden blocks about this big with leather straps on the sides so that they had, it's like they had 2 iPads glued to their hands. And these wooden panels had these little tiny metal hooks, kind of like the things you use to groom a dog. And they would give this person a hunk of cotton, and then they would take this hunk of cotton and they would do this. And what they're doing is they're aligning the threads and they're knocking out the little seeds. And they would do this for 7 or 8 minutes. And I've been doing it for 15 seconds, and already my arm is starting to give me trouble about it. It's just not like I can't do it anymore, just not fun. And they would do that 6 days a week for 10 hours a day for 30 years. And you ask yourself, how is it possible that somebody could do a job like that? How? And then you realize that a job like that is a step up. It's a big improvement over being a coal miner. They had the coal mines, the cruelty of first stage capitalism, especially in England, it really is astonishing. The miners took care of themselves. They set up their own funds for guys who were injured who couldn't work again and so on. But the company really was just it's like the White Star Line when the Titanic went down. Universally remembered among the heroes of that night was the band. They were once it was 7 or 8 musicians, and they were freelancers. They weren't hired. They were contracted out by White Star Line, and these guys could have gone. They weren't ship's company. They weren't on the ship's company register. They were not employees. They were independent contractors, and these 7 or 8 musicians, I want to say it was 8, could have made a run for their lives and had some chance of survival, but they decided, after the leader, whose name I keep forgetting, and I am embarrassed that I've forgotten his name. I can see his face. Somebody will tell me what it is in a second. But they decided to go back on deck. The leader went out there with his violin, and every one of the other 7 members of the band went out there on the deck with their instruments and played music for an hour. Wallace Hartley. Thank you. Doffers, Astronerd says they were called. Okay, so Wallace Hartley decides rather than a chance to live, he's going to stay here and suffer certain death because he figures that he can comfort a lot of these people by playing music to soothe their nerves at the time of this panic. So this band is playing there for over an hour, I think, until finally the ship goes into the ocean. Every single one of them drowns. Every one of them. And after this was over, and after this story was told, White Star Line billed the families of these musicians for the cost of their uniforms. I'm not making it up. I'm not making it up. They not only did not provide any kind of support or any kind of compensation. They billed the families of these working musicians for the uniforms that were not returned because they're at the bottom of the ocean, along with the musicians who stayed there voluntarily. And when I hear things like that, I just think to myself, that no wonder communism had a following in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, it's inconceivable. Forget as a business practice, it's inconceivable as a human being. What kind of person can write that letter? Anyway, it's the whole thing is just incredible. But back to the whole coal mining thing. My ancestors were coal miners back into history. There were about 6 or 7 generations where they were mill workers and cotton carters. Big step up. And as we're coming forward into the present now, moving forward in time, then there were 1 or 2 generation of plumbers. I think maybe 1 generation of like a haberdasher hat company, but I know plumbers for 2 generations. And then my grandfather, who I never met, came to America in 1915, and he went from being a plumber to being a telephone lineman, which was cutting-edge technology in 1915. He's working in the tech industry. He met my grandmother, who was a telephone operator, stayed a telephone. She was the switchboard operator for Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, until she dropped. And then their son, my father, was a hotel manager, and here I am, internet pundit. So my Aunt Marty told me about her father, who's also the same as my grandfather, and said that he'd always wanted to be a writer and that he was actually a pretty good writer. And she gave me some of his stuff, and he was a good writer, my grandfather, who I never met. But my grandfather was out there in February at dawn hanging telephone wires in Pennsylvania because he had a family to feed. He could not afford the luxury of being a writer. And I can. So I'm writing for him. And all of them. I'm doing all of this for all the coal miners and all of the mill workers and all of them. This is why modern society is in such trouble. This fundamental thing, I think this is really, really boiled down to it. This is the ultimate thing. All of it. All of the problems, all crime, drug use, all of it. All of it comes down to this. We no longer are willing to make sacrifices so that our children's lives are going to be better. When I say we, I don't mean the people listening to this, but I mean as a society. We are no longer willing to do anything. People went into coal mines because they had families of 11 kids and they had to feed them. And they worked in mills doing this mind-destroying carpal tunnel repetitive work for years to feed the family. And whatever it took, they did, whatever it took. I've told this story before. I'll close with it. I just think it's interesting. It's one of these things like the little tattoos on the face that bring home the reality of that life to you. When it came time to take a bath in these slums, these row slums, a lot of them didn't have their own toilet. A lot of them had a common toilet out back. So if you're gonna take a bath, it's not like you just step into the bathroom and turn on the hot water. You have to go down to the pump and get the water, and then bring it upstairs into the bathroom, and you have to heat the water. And so that water had to be heated over either a cold fire stove or something like this. And even if you used a large container, a big tea kettle or something, you're only able to heat a certain amount of water at any given time. By the time you pour that into the bathtub and you get the next round done, the water's cold. But anyway, running a hot bath in 1914 for mill workers or coal miners was a big deal. And that's why they did it once a week. And since they could take one bath a week in those iron standing bathtubs, you would think, given our current ethics, that Dad would go last, and the kids would go first. No, Dad was the one whose skin was turning blue from coal dust. He had to have the hot water. He had to have it. If it wasn't hot and relatively hot anyway, then he would not. He wouldn't get any of it off. So Dad gets into the bathtub first. And he scrubs with lye soap and stuff and gets this week's worth of coal dust out of his pores, out of his hair, all of it. So he gets out of the bathtub, and needless to say, the bathtub's in pretty bad shape. Then Mom takes a bath. And then every one of the kids, one by one, takes a bath, 11 of them. And by the time they get to the last kid, to the baby, the water in the bath is not only cold, it's black as ink. It is India ink black. And the water was so opaque that if you were washing the baby last and you forgot about it, you could throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's where that expression came from. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The reason that makes sense when they wrote it and doesn't make any sense today. What does it mean, throw the baby out with the bathwater? You can't fit a baby down a drain. No, but in those days when you had to empty a tub of water that was absolutely black, you could lose a baby in there. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That was life. And it just tells me that progress and civilization and healthy societies are generated by people who are trying to make a bad situation better for their kids. And once the situation for their kids becomes unimprovable, essentially, then there's no reason to do this anymore. And then that just goes away. And you're left with nothing but narcissism and selfies until it collapses, at which point people start having a lot of kids because that's your retirement plan. You're not getting Social Security and you don't have an IRA. If society collapses, if you're going to live to be, the ripe old age of maybe 40, you'd better have a bunch of kids ready to work for you and feed you when you can't anymore. And this is it. It's today's young people live under the asymptote. One of the first arguments I make, I love it. An exponential curve is one that does this. It increases rapidly over time to the point where it's a vertical line, and you can never actually get there. Asymptotic line is the exact opposite. It starts out going up high very, very quickly, and then as time continues, it gets lesser. It climbs higher and higher at a smaller and smaller rate, till eventually it becomes so flat that it doesn't actually reach the margin. So this generation is born under the asymptote, and what that means to me is 2 generations ago, or 3 at the most, if Dad worked like a slave, he might get electricity in the house, or hot running water, or both. Going from having to haul those buckets up to being able to turn on a faucet and have hot water come out, that is an enormous increase in the quality of life for you and the entire family. But how do you do that for a millennial? I'm not picking on them by name now. I'm just saying, as a person of that age, as a person, young millennials now, because some of the older ones are in their 30s. But if you're a 17, 18-year-old kid today, how do you produce that level of increase in the quality of life? How do you improve the quality of life, and what would motivate you to work that hard in order to lift the quality of life of kids who have never been hungry, never been cold, never known any pain at all that wasn't accidentally caused and alleviated in the half hour it took them to get to the ambulance or the hospital? They've never been bored. They've never had to sit and think about things. They've never been out of contact with anybody. How do you improve that person's life? It's not possible. All you can do is make the luxuries marginally better. And then what happens is, the real reason that this socialism is so popular and getting more popular every day is because they haven't had to work for anything. They've never had to work for anything. They've never, generally speaking, had to do anything even really unpleasant. Certainly not for years and years and years. And so if you never worked for your money, then money's just a thing that's out there that got scattered over the land by the wealth fairy, and it's not fair that some more landed on some people than it did on others. It's just not fair. Of course they don't value money. Of course they're ready to go for socialism because they haven't had to earn money in the way that we have. And I don't personally know. I know they're in the military and so on. I personally don't know any millennials that ever did a job that they thought was... A lot of them did jobs that they didn't like, but any job that you would consider to be like unpleasant, and I'm talking about things like security guard or limo driver or something like that. They don't toil, says Woody Fool. That's good. They won't brook inconvenience. That's right. If the job becomes less than fun, they quit. Because they can. Because they can. And any of our parents and our ancestors would have done it too. If you can do nothing, that's what people will do. It's how they're built. And we reached the point, out of the hard work of so many generations, that now our kids don't have to do anything. And they can stay at home. Their quality of life doesn't fundamentally change. In a lot of ways, it's easier for them. They don't have to deal with the stress of paying bills and stuff. They just go back and live with their parents. Maybe they went to college, maybe they didn't. But what's the harm? It's not like they're starting their own families. It's not like they've got 5 kids in the spare room or in the basement. They're just eternal children. And that's the thing that is the greatest crime against these millennials. It's so hard for me. I'm getting much better at it, but it took a while for me to constantly remind myself that the millennials didn't ask for this. This was not what they asked for. This was imposed upon them. But what do they do? You know? How do you connect people to this? And because they never have to do, and this is the point, because they never have to do anything unpleasant, they never really earn anything. Not in the way that not in the way that it means. I don't pretend that I earned anything even remotely close to what my coal miners or mill worker ancestors did. Nothing I have ever done in my life comes close to being nearly as bad as the day they had to deal with every day. But I've had to do a lot of jobs I didn't like, a lot of jobs. Office temp at insurance companies, and I was a limo driver for 3 years and lifting bags from people who were 10 years younger than me into the back of limousines, and I was a security guard, and I was on the night shift. And I had to walk around this building starting at 11 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning and just turn these little keys and eat my frozen TV dinner for half an hour in the back room there, and boom. And it's not anything like what my ancestors went through, but it wasn't fun. It wasn't a choice that I would have made. I just had to do it because if I didn't, I wasn't going to college. And they don't ever have to do that. And since they never had to do that, how are they ever going to appreciate the fact that that they could make a living talking into a camera? How could they possibly, how could that mean anything to them? They've grown up talking into the camera. This is the floor for them. I know Scott and Steve and I, Scott especially because we do the extra show together, and all the other stuff that Scott does for us. We just constantly just like, can you believe we're getting away with this? We are getting away with it, but we earned it. Both of us earned it, and this is the part that I feel most sad about for the millennials, because they've never had to undergo hardship or unpleasantness or do anything dreary or grinding, or except in video games, grinding in video games, but they've never had to do really nasty stuff or even remotely unpleasant stuff. And so since they never had to suffer during those periods and keeping their eye on the reward, they will never know, ever. They cannot know the fundamental joy that you get from achieving something. They can't have it. They can't have it not because they're not capable of doing something. They can't have it because they were never, ever forced to do something that they didn't want to do and have something to compare it to. It's child abuse. It's child abuse. And it's just terribly, terribly sad. Really, really tragic. Steve says, do they know what they're missing? They don't, Steve. They don't know what they're missing. It kind of ties back to the space age thing again. But they don't know what they're missing. They never had to want it. There's nothing more cruel than giving a child, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but I'm just, the only examples prior to this current generation were trust fund kids. I have never known a trust fund kid whose parents were really spectacularly wealthy. I've never known one of them that turned out even kind of okay. And the reason they didn't turn out kind of okay even is because they're dilettantes at everything. Everything's just kind of a whim. Everything's kind of a hobby. They never had to go to work, ever. And so they'll never know what it's like to have the kind of job that's not work. I haven't gone to work in 12 years. Which would explain the delay on the videos. But just think about that. It is impossible for them to experience that joy and ecstasy of success and achievement because they have never, not that they can't do things, it's just that they have never had to suffer through the hardship that gives it perspective and meaning. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I was getting some dinner 2 nights ago, and I stopped at Five Guys for a cheeseburger. I just shot the first of these segments that you saw, the still from earlier, and this family walked in, and they're standing next to each other, ordering. And every single one of them are down here playing the two kids are playing like Candy Crush kind of video games and stuff, and mom is texting somebody, and then they walked over and they got their drinks, and this kid got this drink and nearly ran into me because he's navigating his way through this restaurant, but he's still playing this game. And then they sit down over there, and I look at them, and they don't say a word to each other, and they might as well be on different planets, and they're not even doing anything constructive. I mean, it's not even that they're building any kind of skills or anything. I mean, they're just moving geometric shapes around. And I'm just thinking to myself, somebody please, I don't believe in this whole child protective services thing, but would somebody please, please, please take these kids into the mountains and put them in a cabin for a month with no internet, please? I don't know if they'd survive it. I was close to In-N-Out. Kulak76 says, Five Guys not bad if you weren't close to an In-N-Out. I had to drive past an In-N-Out to get to Five Guys. But In-N-Out in California is a half-hour wait just to order. So, anyway. So, there you go. Merlin, being kind, says, someday that kid could say, hey, I ran into Bill Whittle at a restaurant. He won't say that. Not only will he not know who I am, I appreciate the thought, but he won't know he ran into me because he never saw me. We were just in the same room together, 3 feet away for half an hour. Anyway, the discussion now turns on which is better, Five Guys and In-N-Out. I prefer Five Guys, frankly, but mostly because I'm a fan of the peanuts. Peanuts, I said. Texas Roadhouse used to have that scoop up a big old thing of peanuts and just eat them while they're waiting for your food to come. And every time I did it, by the time the steak got there, I was like, yeah, I'm hungry. Don't need any more. All right, guys. Almost 3 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes. I spent a whole lot of the first time doing that. For those of you members who are watching or either recorded or live, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to take more questions from there. I will be doing more and more of that as time goes on. The questions are very, very good, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but we'll set up one of those every week. And we'll do some from Facebook too, I guess. But in any event, this program is brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. And you know who you are. And this is all possible because of you. So thank you very much. And for those of you new members, we had quite a few new members recently. If you're one of those people, thank you, welcome, and be sure to introduce yourself on the website. You will not believe the quality of the people that are here. Which reminds me, I got a chance to use my favorite tech joke in the world yesterday. I was working with this gigantic crew. I've told this before too, but who cares? When we were working at PJTV, the executive producer came in, Owen Brennan, and he was getting ready to leave, and the whole staff got together to say goodbye to him, and he told everybody how much fun he had and how proud he was of the work he did. And when he finished, he said, I'd rather work with you guys than with the best people in the world. And I just thought that was just the greatest line ever. I'd rather work with you guys than with the best people in the world. It makes so much sense. Anyway, Warped Factor says he's new here. Cool name. In any event, thank you for your support. And it means the world to us. And we're doing our very best with it, and I expect we'll be doing a lot more with it. So next week, I am. Let me double check that time. No, I'm shooting it on Wednesday. I should be good for next Thursday. I'm shooting the last of those segments on Wednesday. Shooting one on Monday and one on Wednesday. So I should be here next Thursday night for your Stratosphere Lounge. And until then, one last shot just for the heck of it. Here you go. Looking forward to this very much. I think it's well written, and it's certainly well produced. That's why I was frightened and confused the whole time. So that'll do it for this edition of the Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, and I will see you under the mountain.